Today I'm going to be swapping out the incredibly overkill motherboard that's inside my virtual machine server, which happens to be 128 threads, over half a terabyte of RAM, a whole bunch of PCI Express slots, a million drives, all that kind of stuff, in order to get the power usage down and to make it a little more sensical. I mean, let's face it, it's a really cool motherboard, but I don't exactly need it for running a few VMs. I'm switching to a consumer level platform, which will be fine for just running VMs. My Plex server runs on another 13th gen system. You can watch video on it, and you can watch a video on the other motherboard too. Initially, I was going to go with an AM5 motherboard, but it turns out that there were a couple limitations compared to going with Intel. There are pros and cons to both, but for me, the advantages of going with Intel in this particular case outweighed AMD. I'm going with a Z790A Prime Wi-Fi motherboard from Asus. I picked this because it's got 4 PCI Express 4.0 M.2 slots, and it's got a bunch of PCI Express slots, which I need because I've got 25 gig NIC. I was going to use a GPU, more on that in a sec, and a SAS controller for TrueNAS, which will be virtualized. I've also picked up a mid-range CPU, just a 14th gen 14600K. I really went with 14th gen, which is really 13th gen. Let's face it, Intel, don't lie to everyone. I went with the 14th gen just really because it was basically about the same price when I purchased it as a 13th gen model. I have some 12th gen chips and a 13th gen chip or two, so I thought I should get 14 just to have them all, I guess. When it comes to purchasing any kind of 14th or 13th gen chip, just get whatever's cheaper. It doesn't matter. I picked up a new cooler for it, not to an NHU12A. This is the largest cooler that will fit inside my Rosewill RSV 4500U case, which I'm going to be swapping this board into. The case has a maximum height of 158 millimeters. This literally touches the top of the case. It's just exactly. That's as good as I can get for cooling. For a 14600K, it's pretty overkill. And I picked up a couple 4 terabyte SSDs. I've been trying to avoid buying anything Western Digital, but unfortunately these were the best bang for the buck, so yeah. I also picked up 128 gigs of RAM. More on that in a bit, but going 128 gigs, or specifically going 4 DIMMs on DDR5 is usually insane, and I don't really recommend it. I really wanted the 128 simply because I want to give at least 64 to TrueNAS. I'm kind of stuck getting this much. It really doesn't matter what you get. I mean, this is 5200. On this board with this processor, I was able to get these stable at 4800, which is pretty good for 128 gigs. So I'm not complaining there. I knew I wouldn't get to 5200. 5200 is completely unstable. It just throws memory errors the second you fire up memtest. 4800 is fine. I've also been replacing my SATA cables whenever possible with these Sabrent ones, simply because I've found them a lot more reliable than the ones that come with motherboards, and I picked them up in blue, so I know which ones I've replaced and which ones I haven't. Alright, I'm going to go over a bit of the differences between AMD and Intel with this particular setup. There are effectively nearly identical boards for both platforms with the Asus Prime. They make a 670E version. However, with Intel, all 4 slots for the M.2, there's 4 of them, are all 4.0 speeds, whereas on the AMD platform, only 3 of them are 4.0, one of them's 3.0, and it shares lanes with 2 of the SATA ports. If you use that M.2 slot, it disables 2 of the SATA ports, leaving you with only 2 total. That could be a problem if you're using a lot of SATA drives as well. There's a little bit of a limitation there, and it's also slower, although in my particular setup, I'm going to be using 2 3.0 drives and 2 4.0 drives, so it's not a big deal in terms of speed. AMD supports ECC memory. However, DDR5 ECC memory is super expensive right now because it's bleeding edge. Whether or not you could actually afford to go get it anyway makes it kind of pointless, because I wouldn't even buy ECC memory for this if I did go AMD. Intel motherboards are supposedly more stable with 128 gigs, specifically 4 DIMMs. I don't know if that's really true, but AMD says you can only get up to 3600 megatransfers per second with 128 gigs. I got 4800. Maybe there's some truth to that. I don't know. It probably just depends on what memory you're buying and everything. One big benefit of this board or specifically going with Intel, is the iGPU. Under Proxmox, you can follow a guide, I'll put a link to it, that will enable SRIOV under Proxmox, allowing you to share the iGPU with up to 7 virtual machines, meaning you can theoretically have a Plex server and a bunch of other stuff running, although I think Plex technically doesn't work right now. I think they have to patch something to get it working under SRIOV. I don't think it actually works right now, but I'm going to be running Plex on another system anyway, so it doesn't matter. You can pass the GPU to each of these VMs. That gives you accelerated remote desktop, that sort of thing. Means I can remove the Tesla card that I have installed and free up a whole slot and use less power, so that's really good. The Intel version also has 2 1x PCI Express 3.0 slots, whereas the AMD board is missing those. So there's a 16x 5.0 slot, and then 2 4x 4.0 slots, and 2 1x 3.0 slots, as if it's not confusing enough already. At least these ones don't seem to disable each other, because a lot of motherboards, depending on what configuration of M.2 and whatever you have installed, some slots turn themselves off, some of them reduce in lanes. This one seems pretty good for lane allotments and everything. I've personally tested this already under Proxmox, and the IOMMU groups, for those of you who fool around with virtual machines, you'll know what I'm talking about. The IOMMU groups are actually really good on this board. Everything's partitioned out, basically, that you'd ever need. So if you need to pass SATA ports and that kind of stuff to your virtual machines or M.2, you're not taking half the motherboard with it when you do it. That was a problem with some of the B650 boards I've used in the past on AMD, where you can't pass like an M.2 slot because it takes some kind of bus controller with it, and then just the VM crashes, that kind of stuff. This actually seems to be a really well thought out IOMMU. I've also undervolted the CPU a bit, knocks about 20 watts off of its maximum power draw. Max multi-core load, I was getting around 240 watts, 220 to 240 watts under full load. Now we're looking at 200 to 220, and that's full load. I mean, on idle, it's using way less. One of the big problems with my existing server is that idle, it's like 200 watts for the motherboard. I guess the CPUs just don't power save like they're supposed to, or just because it's a server, it's like, why would you need power saving? Because they're not supposed to be idle. Either way, the idle power draw on this thing is 25 watts in Windows. That's pretty good. I'm going to lose some NVMe drives because right now I have cards installed in the server. I'm not going to be able to use those. I just don't have enough PCI Express lanes. Right now I'm using an array of 3 1 terabyte SATA SSDs plus 2 Optane drives for VM storage. I'm just going to lose the Optane drives and just go down to 2, a mirrored array. I don't really have any high performance like data transfers going on to the VM drive, so it's not a big deal. And that'll free up a whole bunch of PCI Express lanes. It means I can use a consumer board. All right, I've got my current server pulled out. As you can see, it is very full. Just the 2 coolers alone take up so much space, and then you have a million SATA and NVMe cables and stuff running every which way. I probably should get custom power cables for this at least. In the meantime, I just have a whole bunch of cables running everywhere. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start pulling out all the cables I can, pull the motherboard, and then see what I can do about which hardware is going to be redundant and what isn't. It's mostly going to be NVMe drives and a few cards, so I'll get that transferred in, get the new motherboard installed, and go from there. So this may take a while. That took quite some time to get everything out and then put all the wiring back in and sort of organize some stuff. Holding over from the existing server, I have all of my 15 hard drives, same power supply, 1000 watt. I removed the SAS expander and just put in a 16 port card that you can't really see. It's kind of off to the side. I don't know if this one works properly. I had some problems with it before, but it could have been a bad cable. I'm going to give it another chance to see if it shows any errors in TrueNAS. I have a 25 gig dual 25 gig Ethernet port. What I do with this one is I add an RJ45 10 gigabit adapter to one port, and I run that into my LAN, like one of my 10 gig ports on my network. And the other port, I run a direct attach copper cable right to my main workstation. That way I have 25 gig link to my computer so I can edit videos off the NAS at max speed. And then I have a 10 gig link to everything else. I bridge all of these ports together in Proxmox, and it just effectively works like a switch. I even bridged the 2.5 gig LAN that's already on the motherboard. It effectively acts like a switch. I'm not buying a 25 gig switch for just 2 ports. Unfortunately, I had to put a NVMe drive into an adapter board. I kind of forgot I had this drive. I run a BitTorrent virtual machine, and I like storing all of the downloads onto a local NVMe drive. I found that it was quite laggy running it over the virtual network into the NAS, like just running all the downloads to the NAS, especially when I had to like check files and stuff like that. It was just really slow. So what this allows me to do is just share this drive, but download directly to it through the VM. I just pass it to the VM. Hopefully I come up with a better solution. I might just get a SATA drive. I didn't actually look in to see if I could separate the 2 sets of ports, because there's 2 sets of 2 SATA ports. Not 100% sure if I can separate 2 into a virtual machine and 2 onto the for the boot drives. As for cooling all the cards, you can see this doesn't have a proper heatsink on it. I have this nice 3D printed part, which I got on Tangle a bit, but I'm going to put that here. It'll keep everything cool. Everything went together pretty simply. There's quite a bit more room. You know, I had to reinstall all the SAS cables and reinstall the rat's nest. So everything's good now. And I'm going to power it up and verify that everything works. And I think that's pretty much it. So now I should pull quite a bit less power. This system, just idle. Granted, it has a whole lot of fans. It has a lot of hard drives. With the old motherboard, was 400 watts idle. That's with Proxmox configured to use power save as a power profile for the CPUs. So it's still pulled 400 watts idle. Hopefully this gets it down a bit. I mean, I know a lot of the power usages from the drives probably start getting them to spin down a bit more. I'm still not 100% convinced that spinning down hard drives kills the drives, because no one's really tested it. People say, oh, well, data centers run them 24/7. Yeah, I know. That doesn't prove the other side, and they still fail in data centers. Come on, Linus. Or actually, you know what? Better yet, instead of Linus, Seagate, you send me like 100 drives and I'll test it. Other than that, I'm just going to go ahead and assume that I can spin down the drives without them blowing up. It's actually been about a week now. I'm all done. I swapped out the server. This is the old motherboard. Everything works fine, except I did have a couple weird issues. One where one of my virtual machines, it's just a Windows 11 install, nothing special, would not boot. The EFI partition is screwed up or something. It's weird that it just didn't restore from a backup properly. It's really weird. I don't know why. Either way, I tried to fix it with the usual Windows tools, but I could not get it to work. So I just reinstalled Windows, but it was really weird that that one virtual machine just didn't work. The other issue I had was with a similar Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus, which is a PCI Express 4.0 SSD. I used this as like a download spot for my BitTorrent install because I like it to be able to check all the torrents and do all that, can copy them off, that kind of stuff without any slowdowns, as opposed to saving them onto the NAS. So I do like dedicating an SSD to it, but I could not get this thing to work properly because it's a PCI Express 4.0 card, and all the adapters, like this U.2 adapter, I just could not get to work because they're all really 3.0. I had a couple just plain M.2 to PCI Express, don't work. I even tried putting it into this adapter and putting it into this U.2 one, which is supposedly 4.0, I think. I had to specifically buy a $9 adapter, and it works fine. I'll have a link to that in the description. That one I know works at 4.0 speeds. I've been running it for days and days, and there's no PCI Express errors or anything like that. So that one I know works. As for this motherboard with its 2 Ice Lake Xeons, if anyone wants me to run any kind of tests on it or benchmarks, maybe I'll do a video on that. I'll fire up the screen recorder and maybe we'll run some Cinebench scores and stuff like that. It's really fast, but it's also an 11th gen desktop equivalent. So even though there's 64 cores and 128 threads and half a terabyte of RAM, it also doesn't clock very high. I don't know what the max multi-core clock on this actually is. I never really checked it. Hardware Monitor was reporting one thing and Windows Task Manager was reporting something completely different. It was kind of hard to pin down exactly what its true clock speed was. I think just simply because they're engineering sample CPUs. Any interest in making a video on this thing before I pop it on eBay and bend all of its heatsink fins back into place? Yeah, let me know. Oh, and also the power consumption for the server with the new board went from 400 watts to under 200. And I imagine the majority of that is in fact the hard drives because there's 15 of them. I'd really like to reduce the number of hard drives I have, but that's extremely expensive because I'm using 12s and 14s. If I switch to 22s, I mean, they're more than double the cost of a 12. So you end up with this just massive bill to get the numbers down. I'll have to look into something about that. But in the meantime, it's definitely reduced the power by a lot.